nerd files about kick wax temperature ranges. But let's be clear, nerd files is marketing. I'm selling you stuff right now, and right now what I'm selling you is this new line of S series stick waxes that Davida made. They're cool. We worked on a bunch of testing last year trying to replicate some of the feel of the M series mix waxes in new snow waxes, and these things worked out. In the process of designing the labels for these things, the question was raised, what should we put on for temperature ranges on the tins? The threshold for wax working is providing enough grip and enough glide to be able to ski. And this is a threshold that very many people are satisfied by. In fact, we hear it all the time at races from people who basically say, oh, you know what works? And the answer is a lot of things. A lot of things work most of the time. Sometimes kick waxing is so tricky that the it works threshold is a really high bar. But generally, we're looking for a little more than that. We want to have a competitive advantage. That's what we're out here for. So waxes are all packaged with temperature ranges as a guide to help make selections. The problem with these temperature ranges is they just don't deliver a very good predictor. What is helpful is waxes tend to have a clear progression. They're often packaged in terms of colors, and we've adopted that straight up, because why not? So blue is colder, violet is more intermediate, red is getting pretty warm, and yellow is wet. What the color ranges help us really define is a progression, that if you don't have enough kick with the blue, you should move to the violet. I think everybody understands this. And at its most basic, this is advanced waxing. Hey, if you're on extra blue and it doesn't work, try special purple. My cousin Sverre made a career out of just waxing up the line and always putting kids into races. And that's certainly a way to go about it. But if you want to make it more complicated, like we tend to always do, then you need to get a little more in-depth looking for those advantages. Okay, so the problem with temperature ranges on wax tins is that at best, they're unhelpful because the rules are just always getting broken. At worst, they're misleading. And this is a problem that I encounter as I'm trying to define the temperature ranges on the waxes themselves. This M26, I said -2, +2 because that seemed reasonable. It definitely goes above freezing, but we've also used it really successfully in heavily glazed tracks way down in the -8, -10 range. But should I put -8, -10 on this as part of the range? Because typically that's going to be much too cold a range of temperatures for this to work. The snow tends to be drier in those temperatures, and it's a bad idea to count on it there. We want people to have a good experience when they test the wax, and then to naturally expand the range as they develop confidence in the wax. But we also want them to test the wax. So we need to throw out there a range that encourages people to test it, -1/2 to +1/2, like Start Terva Violet or the old Vouti Super Pink. Both have that same range, and it just doesn't invite a lot of testing because you look at it and you go, well, boy, if that works, it's not going to work for long. So what you're actually communicating with the temperature range is a little bit tough to nail down, and you have to anticipate how people are going to read it. The biggest problem is that waxers need to be able to think in terms of a wide range of snow conditions and track conditions and temperature-induced change and traffic-induced change. What's going to happen to the wax and the snow and the interface over the course of a race? And the problem with the temperature ranges is that it creates the implication of the understanding that this is all based on temperature, and it's just not. So the big secret here is that the ranges are just made up. Literally, someone does a bunch of testing, they figure out a wax, and they assign a color and a range. It doesn't necessarily hold. Here's the interesting thing. Here's an old lead tin of extra blue, and the temperature range is 0 to -2. Here's a not quite as old, not lead tin, and that one is 0 to -4. And here's a somewhat newer extra blue, and that one says 0 to -7. And while this is not by any means the newest extra blue, it is V40 at this point, and it is -1, -7, or in old snow, -3 to -10. I don't know if the wax has actually changed. I wouldn't say that this 0 to -2 gets used wildly differently from this -1 to -7. So what's changed? Well, one of the things that's changed is back when they were making lead tins, people were generally skiing on lightly groomed, maybe a snowmobile drag, tracks. People generally were not skiing on man-made snow. The race laps were much longer. I mean, the Holmenkollen used to be, well, it probably used to be a single 50K, but for years it was two 25K laps. So condensed trails, man-made snow, heavy grooming equipment, and just the evolution of technique and equipment means that we're looking for really different performance out of the wax from back in these days, when I'll also note that we were typically waxing from tip to tail or close to it, or maybe the heel way up toward the tip, or at the peak of sophistication when I was a child, it was like extra blue under the foot and then green on the tips and tails. It was a different time. Typically, we're using warmer, stickier waxes over less of the ski in colder conditions because the conditions are more compact, harder, and we're riding more clear of the snow. So let's talk about how the wax and the snow actually work, what the variables are that help to determine that interface. Grip can come from either physical penetration of the snow crystal into the wax or from adhesion based on chemical content in the wax with the snow crystal. They actually put like glue in the wax, as Davida calls it, glue, to adhere to the snow crystals. On the snow, we really have to consider the crystal size and the shape, the snow response and the track surface and the available moisture. I mean, let's talk about these things. Available moisture, this is significantly related to temperature. Of course, as it gets warmer, the available moisture increases, and it makes a really big contribution to the performance demands of the ski. The crystal hardness and resistance is another thing. If the crystals are going to penetrate the wax, then a much harder and more resistant crystal can be asked to penetrate a harder wax, and it's got to release in order to glide, and so the harder wax is going to be easier for the crystals to release from as well. And that too is pretty significantly related to temperature. Crystal size and shape, really big deal, and not remotely related to temperature. A rounded, dulled, large crystal needs a lot of wax with a lot of penetrability to be able to bed in if it's going to kick on any kind of penetration, whereas a small, super sharp dendritic crystal is capable of penetrating a much thinner layer of wax and a harder layer of wax typically. And the big one is the snow response and track surface. We're talking almost, well, yeah, there's some relation to temperature, but it's a minor relationship. But we're talking about the starting level of compaction or grooming, whether the snow is undergoing plastic deformation. Plastic deformation is if you push on something and it changes shape and doesn't bounce back. That's plastic deformation. And we're talking about compaction. We're talking about compacting snow. Or do we get viscous flow? Is it all moving? Is it loose, unconsolidated, and moving underneath the ski, or some combination thereof? Both of these contribute really dramatically, not only to the type of camber we're using, though certainly we want to pay attention to camber, but to the level of kick support demanded from the wax. So that's happening on the snow side. On the wax side, we all have this tendency to think of it as graduated hardness. Special blue is harder than blue, which is harder than extra blue. And that might be the case, but hardness is not the only thing that governs the way the wax works. Of course, hardness has a big role in governing the penetrability, how easy it is for the crystals to penetrate the wax. And that is a big part of this thing. But there's also viscosity. Viscosity is a term used to describe internal friction. People understand it intuitively in motor oils because it's used to define them. Or, you can think in terms of honey or maple syrup as viscous fluids. As you pour them, they're thick. And what we're talking about is internal friction. Viscosity, I believe, is an interesting concept when you come down to the level of support wax can provide once crystals have penetrated. Do they resist flow and therefore hold the crystals? Then there's adhesion, and this is a big one, all right? How much glue and what type of glue is in the ski? How much contact adhesion do you have? We often refer to wax as providing flypaper kick. We're talking here about just light pressure and not relying on a lot of penetration in order to get really good grip. That flypaper grip tends to imply a higher level of adhesion between the wax and the snow. And that's a chemical characteristic that is steered in the formulation of the wax. And finally, there's temperature sensitivity. Now, this is a big one because temperature-sensitive materials that will change their physical characteristics as the temperature changes mean that the wax changes its characteristics as the temperature changes. And this implies a sort of multi-grade performance, like the wax is going to hang with you through the day, and at its best it can do that. As we're trying to address the characteristics of the snow, we're not just making the waxes more or less hard. We're dealing with hardness, viscosity, adhesion, and temperature reactivity. So where does this leave us with respect to temperature ranges published on wax tins? My personal feeling remains that it's not that useful to have a temperature range on a tin of wax. Maybe the colors are more useful. So cross-referencing waxes between different wax companies and allowing a level of facility in moving from one brand to another might be one good reason for temperature ranges. If there was a standard and the ranges weren't just totally made up, maybe that would be something we could do. Our extra blue, which is a -1, -7, and then we have Rhody Super Blue, which is a -1, -3. We're just not holding them to the same standard. I've used Rhody Super Blue much colder than I've used Extra Blue, and both can go much colder than the range published. Certainly, though, I would not say that Super Blue is a narrower range wax than the Extra Blue. And so, absent a standard, knowing that these two are worth testing on the same day just requires some experience. Or maybe we can lean on the color. But again, once you introduce the fact that the Star Wax is going to have to be violet on that day and the Toko is probably going to end up being red on that day, there aren't really any standards that people are held to in terms of how the ranges are defined. At any rate, suggestions. What should you do in terms of making wax selections? How do you get away from a reliance on temperature ranges or know when you have to break the rules? The first thing is to hit the "it works" threshold. If you can find a wax that works, that provides both kick and glide, and it's not icing and it's giving you enough grip to ski, you've got your starting point nailed down. From there, within a single range, you can work up or down the range, looking for either more speed or more kick. One of the things that we've seen many times in the past is this bimodal distribution of characteristics where it can be a cold day and Start Green and Rhody Green and Rex Green are all working really well, but the blues are a little slow, but then we get into the violets and we get back into faster wax and way better kick. So you can go searching sort of more than one standard deviation from your central range and look for something really special. But usually you're going to end up steering it within that range, and more useful than trying to go way outside the range is look for the optimal wax inside the range. That's when you should know that testing your Extra Blue against your Super Blue against your S20 against your Rhody -1, -7 and Rex -1, -4 is going to help you find the best of the waxes in that range. The most sophisticated level of waxing really starts with building an understanding of the physical properties of the wax and recognizing the demands and the changing demands of the snow conditions as they go along. And when we reach the point where we're no longer satisfied with waxes that are in the range and we need more kick, we need to know whether we should just be working up the Swix VP range or jumping over to a Klister mix. There are lots of options out there that are kind of a lateral move in terms of temperature range, but a big move in terms of internal chemistry to provide a very different approach to gathering the kick. And that's where most of the really big advantages come from, rather than messing around just in the hard wax range looking for a slightly different version of the same solution. As waxing gets more and more challenging, as we get more man-made snow in the mix and more moisture involved and more traffic and more heavy grooming equipment, these Klister mixes become a really big part of things. We also really need broad range performance from our standard hard waxes, waxes that we know are going to hang in there for a really long time. And that's where I believe some of the more modern waxes like Rhody's Top Line waxes or these waxes from Star have a benefit over many of the older waxes. Okay, takeaway message. Temperature ranges are made up. In the case of these Star waxes, I made them up, so I can tell you just how made up they are. Really seat of the pants. I think that's the same with every company out there. There is no science dictating the temperature ranges of the waxes. Experienced waxers know that 70% of the time we're going to be outside of the published range on the wax. Typically, we're putting on much warmer waxes than what are indicated, but sometimes we're actually going a little on the cold side of things. If you're stuck looking at the temperature on the tin and looking at the thermometer and only putting on the wax that matches what the thermometer says, you're going to have way more frustrating days than you are successful days. But getting past those temperature ranges will open up a world that makes waxing actually considerably more simple. So that's it. Ignore them. Ignore the temperature ranges. I wish they would just all go away. But for the time being, they're still here.